Let's discuss how to get the most from your data with Alexandra Mannerings. Hi, and welcome to Driven's Fundraising Superheroes podcast. I'm your host, Sabrina Shishente, and as an innovator in nonprofit technology, our team at Driven is determined to help you unlock your true fundraising potential. We specialize in donor, member, and volunteer management, and you can give us a visit at trustdriven.com to learn more. How can we use our data to make smarter, more value-based decisions? When some think of analytics, they believe it's black and white. But when you're dealing with nonprofit data, it's much more than that. It's about using the numbers to help guide your mission forward. Alexandra Mannerings started Merakenos to advance how we use data, with a special focus on those people and organizations new to analytics. Together, we can transform the world one data-inspired decision at a time. She joins us today to share how you can approach data in a more effective and heartfelt way. So thank you, Alexandra, for joining me on the show today.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Fantastic. So can you start by explaining the vision behind Merakinos and your journey leading up to it?
Absolutely. Well, my vision is a lot easier than the journey. My vision is to help nonprofits amplify their impact through the power of analytics. And I got here in a very, very winding way. My background is actually in life science. So I have an undergrad in biology. I have a PhD in epidemiology. I studied diseases that spill over from fruit bats into humans for my PhD in sub-Saharan Africa. And you kind of wonder how I got to here, but what I learned out of that experience was how to ask the most impactful questions with limited resources. And that ability has carried me through everything else I've done in my career, whether that's working with a state hospital association where I ultimately was the director of analytics and figuring out how to take data that had been sitting on the shelf for 20 years and turn it into something that really served the hospitals that we all represented, and especially the rural hospitals who did not have their own analytics teams, and how to make it more available for them to really access analytics that gave them actionable insight, not just pretty graphs, but something where they could look at it and go, wait, I need to change this thing. And it's showing me the best place that I could make those changes for the biggest impact. And so after working for the hospital association, I went and joined a startup in the analytics space, was helping everyone from small companies all the way up to top 5 accounting firms learn different analytics software, and really enjoyed that experience and realized, after that, I was really ready to try something on my own. And everyone sort of talks about that entrepreneurial leap. And I realized that I think I'd been building to it for at least 5 years, that this was going to be the thing I wanted to do. Mm-hmm. And when I took that step, rather than really a leap, and started my own place, I realized all these random skills were coming to bear, not just my ability to ask questions as a scientist. I think of myself as a scientist who worked with data rather than a data scientist, but also, my ability to talk to people. I love to talk, and that got put to use in my PhD and interviewing and all of that, but really getting to what's the business question people have? How are we going to help them? Because if you don't understand where you're going, you're not going to know how to bring analytics to bear on it. And so then I ended up with Merakenos as really an expression of everything I've been working on over the last 10 years.
Yeah, that's so interesting that you come from a science background and now you're working with nonprofits, but I guess, the motivation is still there. Like you're trying to solve problems, you're trying to make the world better. And you really need to be analytical to do that.
Absolutely. And for me, the desire to serve just nonprofits comes from 2 places. One, having worked with huge companies, I get very fed up with organizations that aren't willing to make a change, right? I don't want to dump something into a black hole, and even if they're going to pay me tons of money for it and not see any impact out of it. And nonprofits are so committed to doing the right thing, that if you give them a solution that's going to help them do the work that they do better, they're going to put it into work. They're going to take that advice. And so that's the first thing. And the second is just that idea that I want to use data for good.
Mhm.
And I want to make sure that this power, right? With great power comes great responsibility, and data is great power. And I'd love to make sure that data are used for good, to make the world a better place, rather than potentially just to make a company more money.
Exactly. Yeah. When working with nonprofits, what was the number one misconception you noticed that a lot of them have about their data and their analytics?
I have to pick just one. Well, two. I'm gonna fudge it. I'm gonna give you two.
Sure. Yeah.
The first is I'm too overwhelmed and too busy to try to figure out how to do analytics. Right? Too busy, too overwhelmed. I don't have time. That's the first misconception. And I get it, because we are all too busy and too overwhelmed. And you can do this in small steps, right? You don't have to go from 0 to 100 miles per hour in a day. You can find ways to take these little steps to bring analytics just a little bit closer to you, to add just one little thing that you're tracking that's going to make a difference in one place. And then you add the next one when you're ready. So that's the first one. The second one is data and analytics are only for fundraising. So this I hear a lot, right? And this is partially because that's, right, for some reason, everyone thinks that numbers go with finance and finance only, right? And one of my jobs as an analyst, I reported to the CFO. And I always questioned this, because I was like, why is data part of the finance department? Like, data supports everything we do. It shouldn't be just part of finance, but there's just this inseparable thing from like money and numbers, and that's therefore where data belongs. So I'd love for us to think beyond that. How can we use analytics, not just to make sure we're serving our donors properly and engaging them the most that we can, but also that our programs are the most effective, that our hiring practices are the most effective, that our website's working the way that we want, that our social media is doing what we want, that any change that you make, that you measure that effectiveness, or that you research how you can do something in a more impactful way. It doesn't just have to be fundraising.
Yeah, because the data doesn't lie. I spoke with Kenjai. He's known as Kenjai, the AMS guy, and he deals with AMS systems. And he talked about the morality of data and how men lie, women lie, data never lies. So if there is a problem that comes up with your numbers, then you have to solve the environment that caused that issue. So it really brings things to the surface, and it makes you have to confront them. And you're right, that doesn't just have to do with finances. If your following is low, well, what's up with your social media? Are you not posting enough? Maybe you're not posting content that people see valuable. So I completely agree. There's so much you can discover from your numbers beyond just the finances and fundraising stats.
And you bring up a great point about that morality of data, because data will also call you on your BS, right? So we as humans have a huge tendency to see what we believe, right? Not believe what we see, but to see what we believe. And it's very difficult to shake us out of those preconceived notions, whether they're unconscious biases, whether they're the way that we think the world works, or how something's going to respond. And so I brought up the hiring practices one, because I think this is a really important one. Is you might think you're doing a really good job being diverse in your hiring practices, or getting the best kinds of people. But unless you're actually looking at your numbers, at your data, you don't really know that. And it's very easy to trick yourself. Right? You can pat yourself on the back and be like, I did a great job, and miss that, oh, wait, every person that you just hired for your executive team came from your same background. Maybe they came from the same company that you came from, or maybe they came from the same education background you came from, or maybe they look like you, right? But all of your, directors and below, you've done a decent job in reaching out. And unless you have those numbers to challenge you, we trick ourselves really easily.
Oh, totally. Yeah, you definitely see what you want to believe. And that's why it's so important. You have to have those hard facts in front of you, and then mix them again with your values, which we'll talk about a little later. You spoke on this in your previous answer, but how do nonprofits shift that mindset to approach the numbers openly? Is it all about just trying to go in without bias? Is it like a skill that takes time that you have to practice?
Yes. And we'll never not be biased. Like, welcome to being human, which is again why it's important to put numbers against that, because it's just how our brains work. And in fact, if we weren't biased, we wouldn't be as good as we are at being human, right? There's an upside and downside to thinking the way that we do. It helps us get stuff done. We operate much faster than computers in making decisions, But that's because we can shift through what is most important to us much faster, right? But it leads us to also make mistakes in other places. So recognize that we're going to be human, and we're never going to change being human, and we shouldn't change being human, but you can put numbers in place to like be guardrails on that. But to your point about shifting the mindset, it is practice. The term data literacy is very popular, and I'm a big proponent of what it represents. I'm not sure I'm a fan of the term data literacy because it implies somehow that we can become as fluent and literate with numbers as we are with words. And that's not true, because we are pre-programmed for language. We come biologically primed for language. We don't come primed to be statisticians. So it's always going to be work. It is always going to take practice. It is always going to take a conscious effort to interpret a number that comes in front of you, or to understand an analytic that comes in front of you. So I still catch myself sometimes making mistakes or taking shortcuts or misinterpreting something because I wasn't really on it then. And so to take that step of like, how do we bring analytics in? It's about making sure that you give yourself the education you need. I don't expect that you can just logic your way through it, because statistics are a different scale. Training, right? Both in how to do analytics, but also how to understand analytics, right? Training for your whole company. It's also then a culture shift, because it is easy to fall back onto our old ways. So making sure that you put things in place that you are always asking to see the numbers on something, or the data on something, or the research on something. I like to say that one of the best things you can do is create a role that I call the devil's analyst. And it comes from this idea of the devil's advocate, right? You should always have someone, and it can rotate who that person is, who, when you get an idea that really sticks, someone goes, hang on, what data would have us change our mind about this? Because when you ask it the other way, rather than what data supports this idea, if you ask what data would disprove this, you're going to go out of your way then to actually try to find that questioning data that may give you pause. When we look for data that reinforces what we already think, it's very easy to ignore the stuff that disagrees with you. So just promoting that person who's like, your job is to ask us what could disprove what we think right now, can really cement that culture of bringing data to bear on all the work that you do.
That's so cool. And that goes back to exactly what you said before. You see what you believe. So if you put that in your head, you're going to see it.
Yeah. And there's, I can share you a link if you have show notes that you can share as a resource.
Yes, yeah.
Great exercise on this. I'll give you 3 numbers, and you try to tell me the pattern of these 3 numbers. And if you tell me the pattern, like 3 numbers back, I'll tell you if it fits my pattern, or I can say it doesn't fit. And you can use that as evidence, right, to try to test your hypotheses about what you think the pattern is. And it's amazing to watch people when they pick a set of numbers, and it fits the pattern. And he says, and then they'll say, oh, the pattern is numbers double. He goes, no. And then they'll look at him, and they'll give him another 3 set of doubling numbers. And he'll say, yeah, that fits my pattern. And they'll go, well, why is it not doubling? And they don't think, well, give something that doesn't double and see if that still fits the pattern, right? They keep trying to just reinforce this belief that they have, rather than trying to disprove the belief that they have. And it's amazing just how strong this tendency is in us. And watch the video, because it does this amazing job of how he interviews like 5 different people, and they all do it the same way of just continually trying to find things that reinforce this belief, even when he keeps telling them that's not the rule, but they're like, but this fits it. And it's like, there's other things that could fit it too, but until you try to disprove it, you'll never make it to where, you're trying a new rule.
Yeah. In your opinion, what is a data-driven mindset? We've talked a lot about how you approach data, but what does it truly mean to be data-driven in your decisions?
And I think that's a great question, because I have fallen victim to what the problem I'm about to say is that it's easy to think that then it means everything you do must be directed by data. And that's not actually what a data-driven mindset is. I like to think of it almost as like the fuel you put in your race car. So being data-driven, right? It's the fuel that's powering you forward, but it's still following your values. So to make this a little bit clearer, being data-driven means that you as a human with a heart are deciding what matters to you, whether as an organization, as a team, as an individual, you're saying, this is the direction I want to go. This is what I want to accomplish. whether it's reducing homelessness, whether it's, ending hunger, whether it's being a better parent, whatever that end goal is, you decide that as a human. And data cannot disprove or prove whether that's the direction you should go. That comes from what matters to you. Being data driven is then making a commitment to always using the analytics, not this feels good to do, but really is the step I'm taking getting me the direction I want to go. So it means measuring progress towards that goal that you've set in an analytically robust way, so that when the numbers don't lie, and when the numbers call you out and say that last step you took, it went backwards, you didn't actually get closer to your goal, that you then trust that those numbers have pointed out you've gone the wrong direction or you've lost some ground, and you try something different. So being analytically driven, being data driven, and making data driven decisions means that you rely on evidence showing that you're making progress or showing that you didn't make progress, and responding accordingly. I always say that I think we get ourselves in trouble with politicians making the actual policy to achieve a goal, because they'll pick policy that feels good, or that pleases their constituents, or that is politically expedient. And it doesn't then achieve the goal that they started out. And that's an example of not being data driven, right? Not picking a step based on what is evidenced to be most effective. And that we don't then, when you put the policy in place, we don't put it in place with a measure to say, if this thing doesn't go up, if this number doesn't go down, then this policy isn't effective and we should try something different. It's like, well, this policy was a huge success because everyone liked it, or because it got me elected again, or right, or it feels good. And I think that last part's the hardest, right? It's hard to let go of things that just sound right? It makes sense to us, that fit our worldview. But that's, again, not being data driven. That's being sort of, I don't want to say emotionally driven, because emotions are really important. It's being misled by understanding what we're trying to do. Like, it's losing then the commitment to making the most progress. Being data driven is committed to making the most progress possible.
Mm-hmm. And you have to really use those analytics, like you said, as the fuel in the car. And it's hard when you have such strong feelings about one thing than another. But how far do you go until you decide that something's not working? What if you just did one test and the numbers are telling you, no, it's wrong? But if you would have waited another week, another month, it could have changed. How do you deal with that uncertainty?
I don't know, meditation. There's actually not a great way you're never going to get rid of uncertainty. Mm-hmm. This is something I struggle with a lot, because I want to know everything. I want to know all of the things. And that's when I'm going to make a decision, when I know all of the things. And it turns out you cannot know all of the things. You really do have to be comfortable in a space of uncertainty. And I think sometimes we avoid analytics because analytics force us to admit how uncertain things are. And it will always be that way. Things will always be uncertain. And there is not actually one right answer of how long do you give something before you say, well, it didn't work. This is going to have to be based on how many resources you have to put towards trying something, how fast you need to see results, and how many other options you have, right? If you've got dozens of other options and you try one and it didn't kind of work out, maybe only give it one shot and you try something else, because there's lots of different ways you could get there. And there's probably going to be more than one way that works, right? I was just talking to another gentleman who said, spend 80% of your time on things that you have found work, and then 20% of your time experimenting. And then every now and then, maybe every quarter, maybe every 6 months, reevaluate that 20% against the 80% you're doing, and drop the lowest performing of the 80% if you found, right, something in the 20% that does better, and move that into your 80%. And that you just sort of continually do these iterations. And so maybe to your point as well, of like, when do you know to stop trying something? Maybe the answer is when you find something better, right? As long as you're committed to always spending this proportion of your effort or your resources or your time exploring potential options. And then when you found something better, you switch it out. Because typically also, it's not that it works or it doesn't. It might kind of work. So you pick the thing that works the best that you got out of the options that you have. And then you keep iterating and trying other things on the side, and then bring that in when you find something that works better than what you were doing before. Nothing's going to work perfectly either. We in nonprofits work with such complicated social issues that there's never going to be something that just 100% solves everything.
No, never. That's a really cool concept, the 80-20 rule.
Yeah.
I find that, putting it in that kind of perspective and giving you that opportunity to try new things, but still focus on the things that are working. Yes, it's beautiful. I love that.
That was from Boris Kievsky at .org strategy. So full credit where credit is due. I did not come up with that.
Fantastic. I'll make sure to have that resource in the description box as well.
Definitely.
When you're going into your database, are there any things that you recommend nonprofits consider when making decisions? Are there key metrics every organization should look for? Maybe key areas that they should be tracking?
So there's rarely one actual like literal metric where I'm like, everyone should be tracking, I don't know, donors who convert from one time to long-term donors or whatever that is. There's not really one thing that I say, this is what you must track, but instead there are types of metrics that everyone should be tracking. So the first thing you start with is, what is your organization's purpose? Why do you exist? And again, whether that's to save pets' lives, to fight a disease, whatever, you determine this is my reason for existence, and you should have at least one metric that tracks that outcome. And not the output, the outcome, right? So are you making progress on reducing homelessness? Well, that means that you should be tracking the rate of homelessness in your area. And if you don't see it going down, right, then your organization is not doing what it said it was going to do. And you need to be able to do that. And I think oftentimes we think about this only from the point of view of what I'm going to tell my donors. But if you're committed to being a data-driven organization, an outcome-oriented organization, you need to be measuring that for yourself, right? If you're not doing the thing you said you were going to do, what are you doing with your resources? Mm. And that's a very uncomfortable question to have to face. And I get that. And I am not saying that question facetiously. That's a deep, hard question. So that would be the first thing that every organization should be tracking, right? Are we moving towards the outcome we said we were going to? Then the next thing you should measure are the major tactics that your organization does to achieve that outcome. So if, right, going back to our homelessness example, you should be tracking the level of homelessness in your area. And you can decide how you're going to measure that. Maybe it's nights spent sleeping on the street. Maybe it's number of individuals without, at least a long-term temporary residence. You get to determine the best way based on the thing that you're doing to capture that outcome. And then you go to the next step for those tactics. So if the way that you're doing it is, building the tiny house villages, right? Maybe that's one of the tactics that you're doing. Well, then you should compare, for every dollar spent on tiny houses, what sort of proportion of people are then given long-term houses, or how much does that reduce the rate, right? You should be measuring the effectiveness of that tactic. Or if it's job training, right? You should be tracking for everyone who goes through the job training, what proportion of them then end up in long-term housing, right? Like with a stable housing situation. So then, right, most of us use more than one tactic, and that goes back to our 80-20, right? Then you can look at your tactics and compare them against your outcome and say, are our tactics moving us there? And the ones that are underperforming, maybe you move away from those tactics. And that's a hard decision to make. Maybe this is something your organization's done for 40 years. And you have to look at it and go, wait, it's not doing what we want. Or the situation changes. And maybe it worked 40 years ago, but now we're in a new world and it's no longer effective. But if you're not tracking the effectiveness of that tactic, you won't know that. And you might keep doing it, even though it's not moving you towards your final goal.
Yeah, that's a really good answer, because normally when I ask these questions, I'm always looking for that one number, and there's no one number that's going to fit every organization. No. Every organization is different. Right. Yeah.
And I think about it when I was talking to my accountant about what gets to be considered business expenses, right? Mm-hmm. And I wanted him to tell me these things count as business expenses. And he said, well, the IRS defines it as things that are usual and necessary to accomplish your business. And the reason they're so seemingly vague is what would be usual and necessary to run a circus will be very different from what's usual and necessary to run a school. And as soon as he said that, I was like, yes, that makes so much sense, right? Like, I'm not going to be buying lion food for the school, but that would be a required expense for the circus. And that's the same thing with these metrics, right? the category is the same. We need to feed the school, we need to feed the lion, but the way you're going to do that is going to be entirely driven by what your organization exists to do.
Mm-hmm. That's a great example. Before we head off today, do you have any final tips on creating and executing a data strategy? It's a big question.
I think it goes back to that. Here, I'm going to step it back and I'm going to make it a little bit simpler.
Sure.
Start with looking at the things you're already tracking. Most of us are still tracking something, right? We tend not to just completely fly blind. We're counting something. And so look at the things that you're already measuring and see if they are outcomes or if they are outputs. And what you'll probably find is most, if not all, are outputs, because outputs are easier to count. And by outputs, I mean the things that we do that generate some sort of like tangible thing. So we oftentimes will measure, how many dollars did we give out, or how many meals did we send, or how many lunch kits did we create? Those are all outputs, but they're easy to count because I can go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lunches, right? Reducing hunger is a lot harder to measure. And so to give people that one actionable step that they can take now, look at the things that you're measuring, determine how many are outcomes versus outputs. And if you find that nearly all of the things you track are outputs, challenge you to come up with one outcomes measure that you could track. See if you can either feed one of those output measures into an outcomes measure, or maybe create an outcomes measure and put that next to all of your other outputs and start tracking it as well. And I think what that does for us is it starts to shift that mindset. It starts to shift us out of just counting donation dollars and starting to really measure the impact that we have. And that goes back to my goal of why I exist and why I have a business is I want to amplify your impact. And what gets measured matters, right? What gets measured improves. So if we shift from measuring outputs to measuring outcomes, our outcomes are going to get better, our outcomes will get bigger, and our impact will be amplified.
That's fantastic. Well, that is the perfect place, I think, to end our conversation. Can you let our listeners know how they can get in touch with you?
Absolutely. So you can check out my organization at Merakinos.com. So that's Merakinos.com. And I'm on LinkedIn, Alexandra Mannerings. I don't think there's another Alexandra Mannerings out there. So if you look me up on LinkedIn, I'd love to connect with you or chat with you or ask any questions that you have. I'm happy to answer them.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again, Alexandra, for joining us on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
To understand more about Merakenos and Alexandra and everything that she does, you can visit her at Merakinos.com. That's Merakinos.com. And if you want to learn more about all of us at Driven, maybe even sign up for our newsletter, you can give us a visit at trustdriven.com. There we have all of our resources, past podcast episodes. And like I said, there is a form for you to sign up for our newsletter where you will get our content delivered straight to your inbox. Isn't that fantastic? So convenient. And as always, thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Fundraising Superheroes podcast.